Hello, welcome back. We are now on video 3 for chapter 6. And I would like to discuss the 4 types of unemployment. In video 2, we talked about unemployment and what it is. Now we're going to talk about the 4 types of unemployment. Don't you just love these pictures? Isn't it relaxing to just sit back and look at them? Calm waters. The unemployment rate doesn't really feel like calm waters, but we might as well pretend that we can deal with it at least, right? Okay. So here are the 4 types of unemployment. You have frictional, you have structural, you have seasonal, and you have cyclical. What really matters is frictional plus structural. So frictional plus structural make up the unemployment rate. Notice how I have lumped cyclical and seasonal under frictional because this is exactly what they do. First of all, what is frictional? Frictional is anybody entering the workforce for the first time, or anybody who is in between jobs. So if you really think about what it's saying, it's almost everybody. Now, frictional unemployment can last a short period of time. It can last a long period of time. It often, hopefully, is a short period of time. By short period, I mean it's a matter of a few weeks before a person gets a job. Structural unemployment, on the other hand, is not going to be short-term. This is long-term unemployment. Now, what is structural unemployment? It's called structural because you have to restructure to re-enter the workforce. So structural unemployment right here in purple is when one of 2 things. Businesses are replacing workers with technology. Think, for instance, how the number of cashiers that are being hired is lower than it used to be because of the self-checkout. And now with, for instance, Amazon opening stores where you go in and there isn't even a checkout. You just go in, you sign in with your app, the store recognizes you, you put items, they're testing it now to fix all the kinks before they kind of go nationwide with it. You put your products in your cart, and the cart itself is keeping track of how much you owe. Also the doors when you check out. So you take your stuff, you bag it. On the way out, you authorize the payment, or it's automatically sent to your phone that says, this is how much you owe, these are the items you purchased, and you go, okay. You don't scan anything, you're not standing in line for anything. There isn't even such a thing as a checkout lane. That is a type of structural unemployment, which means one day there might not be any cashiers whatsoever. It's AI replacing labor. So when AI acts as a substitute to labor. The other thing that can happen is too many people entering the same field. So there's a gluttony of workers and simply not enough positions available to them. If you enter a field where there are way too many people who do the same thing, you can become structurally unemployed at some point. Now, what do people do when they're structurally unemployed? They go back to school, maybe, or they get a new certification, or they get new training. You have to have some sort of training / education, one or the other, or both, in order to re-enter the workforce. So this is definitely more of an investment in order to continue with further work in the future, and it leaves people unemployed for a longer period of time. Structural unemployment does increase during recessions. All types of unemployment increase, but if you're wondering why, I want to apprise you of a couple of important points. During a recession is like cleaning house. Businesses look at the fact that the odds are they've been given tax breaks. The odds are they can have bigger write-offs on their books and pay less taxes around tax time. They might be given subsidies in order to maybe invest back into their businesses, like buy new equipment. They take the time to eliminate certain positions permanently. So they create structural unemployment above and beyond the norm. So yes, it does go up. Obviously, frictional unemployment is going to go up predominantly because of cyclical unemployment. This is called cyclical unemployment because of the business cycle. This is when people are being laid off. So it's involuntary unemployment. There is voluntary unemployment. People who are moving, people who are quitting, people who are going on hiatus. But most of the time, if somebody is unemployed, it's involuntary. Someone told them, we don't have this position for you anymore for various reasons. If it's happening because there's a recession and the company is saying, we don't have the sales we used to have, therefore we don't have the revenue we used to have, therefore we're not keeping you and we're sending you home, not because of any fault of your own, not because you're not qualified or not doing a good job, because we can't afford you right now, that is cyclical unemployment. Now, the reason it is lumped under frictional is if you are laid off, aren't you in between work now, in between jobs? Yes, you are. Therefore, you still belong to frictional. Seasonal is a job that's not available all year long. If you're a lifeguard, you don't have a job in winter, especially where the weather, like if you're in New England, for instance. It could be farm work. It could be anything really that is related to either the weather or some sort of holiday. Like, for instance, work that the workers who are hired between October and December for the big holiday season, but they are laid off in, like mid to late January when all the returns have happened and the stores aren't seeing the big volume, whether it's online or in person. So seasonal is a very, very small percentage. Some people don't even talk about it, but that percentage is still for people who are in between work. So it's lumped under frictional. So if you're looking at an unemployment rate of 3.6% currently, it is made up of frictional plus structural. Frictional is broken down. So if you have, for instance, 3% frictional and you have 0.6% structural, this 3%, maybe 1% of it has to do with normal, I am entering the workforce for the first time, or I'm in between. Maybe another 0.9% is cyclical, although there really isn't such a thing right now. I'm just giving an example. Or maybe 0.1 is like seasonal, but it all combines and adds up to being frictional. This is the unemployment rate with its 4 types. Now let's talk about the GDP gap. Let me fix this for you a little bit. Okay, this is better. We can see better now. The GDP gap. What's a gap? Always stop, as simple as this seems, stop and say, what does it mean? Maybe because English is my third language, I don't know what it is, but I have found that I've developed this habit over the years where I pause and say, what does this word mean? What is it really telling me? It's a clue, just like it's a title, it's a clue. It's telling you that there is something, a gap, a space between two things that may or may not be favorable. Mind the gap, as they say when you get off the public transportation in Great Britain, right? So we have positive gaps and we have negative gaps. This straight line here that says sustainable growth, this is the potential GDP or real GDP. And this red line that actually goes up and down, that's not so straight because how many things in life project perfectly like that? That is actually the actual. So you know how in our objectives, we had an objective of high and sustained economic growth, and we said we want the GDP to grow like in the 4th percentile annually. Because it's projected at such a steady rate, this is why you have this kind of curve that just keeps going and going at the same rate. But the actual economy goes through recessions, establishes troughs, goes through expansions, reaches a peak, goes through another recession, establishes a trough, goes through expansions, etc. Well, obviously the actual and the potential are not the same. Now, what is the GDP gap or output gap? Notice how it says output, because total production is what the real GDP measures. The word production also means output. Remember in chapter 3 when I told you quantity supplied is output. It is also production. It is also inventory. These words are relevant because they come back to you in a new form, but they're not really new, are they? So the GDP gap is the output gap. Actual output minus potential output divided by the potential output. So in other words, actual real GDP minus potential real GDP divided by potential real GDP times 100. That's how you know what's really happening. I'll give you an example in a minute. So look at what's happening here. In this stage here at point T, we definitely have a negative output, which means we underproduced. The economy should be producing at this level. Let's say this level right here is 25 trillion, but it is actually producing less, let's say 22 trillion. So there's a 3 trillion gap. Over here, it's the opposite. So let's say where it should produce, for instance, is 27 trillion, but where it actually produced is 28 trillion. There's a positive, an overproduction of that amount. A negative output gap indicates there's slack in the economy as resources are being underutilized. Why are they being underutilized? When people are laid off and machines are not being used as much as before, and raw materials is not engaged as often, and maybe for instance, a company cancels its third shift and nobody is even producing at that hour, all of that ends up being idle resources. If you go back to chapter 2, when we talked about the production possibilities curve, we said most economies don't fall on its PPC. Most economies fall on in their frontier, because in the frontier there's underutilization, there are idle resources. The economy is performing below potential, right? Like here. This is the potential, this is an underperformance, this is your negative gap or behind. A positive output means any slack has evaporated and resources are being fully employed, maybe even to the point of overcapacity. In this case, the economy is performing above potential and most likely overheating. We don't know for sure, but most likely. Because remember, I told you to think of inflation as temperature. And so what's happening here is actually, this is the potential, this is the actual supersedes or expands beyond the potential. You are looking at that positive gap. I'm going to start the next video in a minute when we continue with GDP. For now, have a good one.